Okay, good afternoon.
Come and sit up the front. That way I don't have to shout so much. So, welcome everybody. Welcome back to people who've been to my talks before. Welcome to new faces. For people who haven't been here before, just to explain that what we try to do in these talks is to have some sort of discussion at the end, some feedback. If there are things that I say that you don't agree with, then I'd be very happy to hear your views and opinion. We could discuss some of the issues that I'm going to talk about. If you have any questions, I don't know whether I'll be able to answer them. I'm not a great expert on this topic. It's just I've just done some reading on it. And also to mention, if I say anything that you don't understand, then feel free to stop me, and I'll try and explain it more slowly and better. So, the topic for today is how the US got hooked. The United States has a massive problem with drugs. In 2017, 40,000 people died of drug-related deaths, drug overdoses. That is the biggest cause of accidental death in the United States. In other words, more people died of drug overdoses in 2017 than died in car accidents, to give you an idea of the scale of the problem. So come and sit up the front. So the United States has a huge problem with drugs, but for the last, let's do some quick math, since 1971, so for the last 50 years, the US federal government has officially had a war on drugs. It was President Nixon who originally declared a war on drugs. And in 1973, he created the DEA, the famous DEA, or the Drugs Enforcement Agency. And this federal agency has had a huge budget ever since then to fight the war on drugs. I don't think any other country in the world has spent as much time, as much money, and put as much effort into combating drugs. And yet, we have a situation where the United States has the worst drugs problem by a long way of any country in the world. How did this situation come about? We're going to look a little bit at the history of the US population and drugs, and then we're going to talk about the present drugs epidemic. We have to really go back to the 19th century. In the aftermath of the United States Civil War, the United States Civil War was a huge humanitarian disaster. Not only were hundreds of thousands of people killed, but there were also hundreds of thousands of people who were severely damaged either physically or mentally by the war. And with all these war veterans suffering in mind and body, doctors started prescribing a new drug that had just been synthesized for the first time. In 1874, heroin was synthesized for the first time. And at the beginning, it was believed that heroin was actually less addictive than opium and morphine. And these ex-soldiers would be prescribed heroin in the form of like tonic drinks or cough drops. The consumption of heroin was incredibly widespread. And of course, as soon became clear, it was much more addictive than opium or morphine, and much stronger. But this wasn't realized at the beginning. And in fact, the attitude to get an idea of the attitude to drugs at the end of the 19th century, you have to remember, for example, that Queen Victoria, her favourite drink was laudanum. Laudanum was a mixture of alcohol and morphine. And this was a very common thing, to take laudanum. If you were feeling a bit ill, take some morphine. There was no control over it. And the world's most popular drink, Coca-Cola, as you probably know, the intellectual beverage or the temperance drink, which was made, the original recipe used cocaine. So there was a different attitude to drugs, but by the time of the beginning of the 20th century, doctors and public administrations began to realize that large numbers of people were getting addicted, and in 1924 the Drugs Prohibition Act was enforced, and things like opium and morphine and heroin and cocaine were prohibited or only available under doctor's prescription. So, if we flash forward in time, the next big drugs epidemic in the United States was a direct result of the Vietnam War. You had hundreds of thousands of young North American males fighting a war in terrible conditions. Well, it was worse for the Vietnamese, but still terrible. Far from home, in the middle of the jungles of Southeast Asia, and one of the ways that the soldiers coped with the horrors of war was taking drugs. In fact, the United States Army actually prescribed amphetamines to the troops, and the amphetamines tended to cause even bigger problems, and so once the army realized that amphetamines were such a big problem, they stopped prescribing amphetamines, and the soldiers started using heroin on a large scale. And heroin was actually made available by the CIA. This is an interesting story. The CIA were involved in Laos, in the country of Laos, and they were actually shipping heroin from Laos to Vietnam, and then the soldiers were actually using it. It's an extraordinary story, but we haven't got time to go into it now because it's a different story. But anyway, that's one reason why the consumption of heroin by US soldiers was so high. At one point, they reckoned at the end of the 1960s, beginning of the 1970s, 20% of US soldiers in Vietnam were heroin addicts. And when all these people came back to the United States, they didn't suddenly lose their addiction. There was a huge demand for heroin, and it was famously supplied by a guy called, and I don't know, has anyone seen that film, American Gangster? It's I really recommend it. It's a very entertaining film, very well made, with Denzel Washington and Russell Crowe. And it tells the story of how this New York gangster, Frank Lucas, who had friends in the army, went over to Vietnam, met the big drug kings in Laos, and organized to have heroin sent straight from Vietnam to New York on US Air Force planes, and it reached New York, incredibly pure heroin, and helped create an epidemic back in the United States, particularly in New York and in the Northeast. Then there was the next epidemic was in the 1980s, and again it was closely. You have to remember that at this time the United States is officially at war on drugs. Yeah, we talked about this actually last month, about the extraordinary story of Iran-Contra and how the CIA was responsible for shipping cocaine into the United States. And there is a work that was carried out by a journalist called Gary Webb, who discovered that the CIA and the people who were financing the Contras in Nicaragua were actually responsible for creating the crack cocaine epidemic that hit, this time, southwest United States, New Mexico, California, and particularly it affected the black population in California. There's a film about that story as well, Kill the Messenger. The messenger in this case was the journalist Gary Webb. He published his story in a regional newspaper, and then the Washington Post and the New York Times published stories saying this is completely untrue. It's all fake news. And in fact, this guy Gary Webb was hounded to death. No one is quite sure why he died, but it was officially described as suicide. Maybe it was suicide, but because he'd revealed this story about how the crack cocaine epidemic started in the US government, his career was ruined, and he ended up dying at an early age. So we had an epidemic at the end of the 19th century, another one in the 1970s, and then another epidemic with crack cocaine in the 1980s. The present epidemic is slightly different because we're not talking about an epidemic of illegal drugs, we're talking about an epidemic of legal prescription drugs. And as I said, this current epidemic is responsible, along with other drugs, this epidemic is responsible for 40,000 deaths a year. It's estimated that there have been, from this one drug, which is called... Oh, that's the wrong picture. I don't know why the PowerPoint's gone wrong. The drug that we're talking about is called OxyContin. OxyContin is a drug that was created by a US drugs company, pharmaceutical company called Purdue. And the drug was launched in 1996. Why? Because Purdue had a very, very profitable drug which used morphine, called MS-Contin. It was their biggest selling drug. And this drug was about to lose its patent. And when a drug loses the patent and the drugs company, any drugs company, is allowed to sell it, the profitability of the drug drops by 80%. So Purdue were facing the loss of 80% of the profit on their best-selling drug. Yeah? So what did they do? they brought this new drug onto the market, and the main ingredient, the active ingredient in OxyContin, is a synthetic opiate called oxycodone. And oxycodone is much stronger than opium, it's stronger than morphine. And oxycodone is a drug that had been around for a long time, but it had always been prescribed in very small doses, and it had always been prescribed as a drug in combination with, for example, aspirin or paracetamol, yeah, as a painkiller. But because it had aspirin or paracetamol, doctors could not prescribe large quantities of it, because if you take a lot of paracetamol, it kills you, doesn't it? It damages your liver. What Purdue did with OxyContin was they made it, the reason it's called contin is short for continuous. In other words, they made a drug which was, you only took one pill, but it was slow release. Yeah? So you took one pill and the effect lasted all day. And the drug company argued that because it was a slow release pill, that people would not get addicted in the same way. So, you know, it's an opiate, like opium or morphine or heroin, but the drug company claimed that it was safe. And they said, don't worry about it, because it's a slow release drug, it's different from other ones, therefore, doctors, you don't need to worry about this drug, your patients will not become addicts. It will cure their pain, they'll be happy, you'll be happy, we'll all be happy, yeah? Especially us, because we're going to make a lot of money. OxyContin was made available in dosages which were much bigger than oxycodone pills that had been prescribed before. If previously the biggest dosage was 10 milligrams, yeah, OxyContin was being made available in dosages of 80 milligrams or even 160 milligrams. So 16 times more powerful than all the drugs that had been made available before. So how did Purdue manage to do this? I mean, you know, they're essentially doing something like taking heroin and saying, yeah, it's safe, it's fine, we can prescribe it to ordinary people. If you have, you know, a backache, take OxyContin. If you've got migraine, take OxyContin. If they've been saying, you know, you've got a backache, take heroin, everyone would be going, oh my God, no way. But because it had this new formulation of slow release, and because it was being sold by an established, reputable drugs company, it was accepted. And it was partly because in the 1990s, you know, this is for a perfectly good reason. In the 1990s, medical opinion was beginning to change, and doctors and researchers were beginning to become very concerned, more concerned before, about pain, and thinking about, you know, why should patients, why should people that are ill, why should people that have serious illnesses have to suffer pain when we have medicines that can control that pain? Because of the worry about the addictive effects of opium, morphine, heroin and so on, the dosages of painkillers had always been very, very carefully controlled. And in the 1990s, doctors began to think, well, maybe we're being too conservative. Maybe people need bigger doses in order not to feel pain. And there were some medical studies that came out at that time suggesting that the ideas about addiction were wrong and that in fact opiates weren't as addictive as previously thought. In fact, since then these studies have been shown to be unreliable, and probably, it was a big mistake. But the reason that medical opinion changed was not for a cynical bad reason, but because doctors and public administrations were genuinely concerned that people should not have to suffer pain. That's okay. But the drugs companies and Purdue in particular knew exactly what they were doing. They knew that the drug that they were selling, their new drug, was going to be A, very successful, and B, highly addictive. In fact, Richard Sackler, of whom we'll talk a bit more later, who's the vice president of Purdue, the drugs company, when they were holding a party to celebrate the launch of the new drug of OxyContin, he said, he was heard to say, the launch will be followed by a blizzard of prescriptions. A blizzard. Do people know that word? A blizzard is a snowstorm. Yeah? So you can imagine prescription of receta, right? So it was a very colourful description. Imagine a snowstorm of recetas. And imagine all the dollar bills as well. He said, the launch will be followed by a blizzard of prescriptions which will bury the competition. So they knew that this new drug was going to be incredibly successful. Why? Because once their patients started taking it, they wouldn't be able to stop. And in fact, it was very, very clear that the company knew exactly how dangerous the pills were, because it said, when you get pills, there's a piece of paper that comes with it telling you the dangers, the side effects, how much that you should take, etc., etc. On the instructions with the pills, it said, broken, crushed, or chewed tablets could lead to a fatal overdose. Yeah? So they knew perfectly well. If junkies got hold of these pills and chewed them, they would get the effect that they were looking for. And then, to make matters even worse, in the 1990s, at the end of the 1990s, because of the free market ideology that was becoming stronger and stronger at that time, the United States federal government removed the restrictions on advertising for pharmaceutical companies. Obviously, pharmaceutical companies had been lobbying and pressing the government and saying, don't restrict our business, it's unfair. Why are other businesses allowed to advertise and we're not? So you had a situation where Purdue... here we are. Purdue was allowed to advertise this incredibly dangerous drug. For example, on the right-hand side we have a very nice CD with swing music. Swing is alive. Swing in the right direction with OxyContin. And on the other side we have there, this guy saying your doctor might prescribe an opioid medication, but don't worry, less than 1% of patients become addicted. And there's all kinds of advertising. If you put OxyContin into Google and find images, you'll see any number of images of how they advertise this drug as, like a bit like paracetamol, a bit like aspirin. If you've got a backache, take OxyContin. Just incredible. And not only was Purdue advertising to ordinary people, it was also advertising in a big way to doctors. So, doctors were being given, little things like anything from mouse mats to badges or sun hats or something like that, or they were invited, they were given a paid holiday in order to prescribe more OxyContin. And it was reckoned that by 2002, doctors in the United States were prescribing 6 million doses there were 6 million prescriptions in 2002. The drug was launched in 1996. 6 years later, 6 million prescriptions of this very dangerous drug. And the sales reps, sales rep, those are the people that the drugs company employs to go round to doctors, encouraging them to... Yeah. It's rep stands for representative, representante. Sales reps were earning $400,000 a year in bonuses from Purdue. That wasn't typical for pharmaceutical companies. That kind of money for sales reps was much more similar to the sort of profits that you make selling heroin or any other illegal drug. There was a genuine blizzard of prescriptions. Richard Sackler was absolutely right in his predictions. And another thing because it's a complex series of factors that brought the epidemic about. One other thing that one has to remember, that in the United States there's no system of public health care. So for poor people are not covered by health insurance. There isn't, if you're in the United States, there isn't a kind of health center that you can easily go to. And there aren't necessarily doctors who you can trust. Because it's a very free market in health. If, for example, your doctor has prescribed you OxyContin, right? And you're getting addicted, you need a higher and higher dose. It's quite easy. If your doctor says, no, I'm not prescribing you anymore, it's quite easy in the United States to find another unscrupulous doctor who would prescribe it for you. There's much less control over the prescription of drugs like this. So it's very, very easy for people to end up getting addicted because, as I say, of the lack of adequate medical supervision. And another thing is, in the United States, as I said, there's been a war on drugs for the last 50 years. Public opinion has been educated to think drugs are terrible, that illegal drugs are very dangerous. One has to fight a war against them. But prescription drugs have always been seen as something that are safe. So, although the drug that they were taking was very similar to heroin, and heroin sounds, oh, danger, because this drug was, in a nice little bottle sold by Purdue, a reputable pharmaceutical company, and because it was prescribed by their doctor, people were completely unaware of the dangers of what they were taking. So, some doctors were horrified by what was going on, and they realized that the situation was completely out of control. I mean, in some parts of the country there were stories, by the beginning of the 2000s, there were already stories on television, in the newspapers, about towns where there were so many people dying that the morgue was overcrowded and filled up, and there were bodies lying in the street. There were stories about people going, in the supermarket, collapsing with an overdose in the supermarket, about children finding their parents overdosed at home when they came back from school. Really nightmarish situations that really began to grab public attention. But and as I say, doctors and nurses began to warn about how dangerous this drug was, but because Purdue was a big, powerful pharmaceutical company, and because it could afford to employ the best lawyers, initially, when people, perhaps victims, perhaps patients who'd become addicted and then escaped from the addiction, if they tried to sue Purdue, they didn't have the money to win their cases. The United States is very, very big on civil law. People go to court a lot. But it's very expensive. If you're an individual, to try and fight a pharmaceutical company is almost impossible. So people would go to court and say, look, this company has been selling a product that, I don't know, perhaps killed my wife, addicted my children, whatever. Purdue's lawyers would go to court and persuade the court that that what they were doing was perfectly legal and that nothing should be done about it. And the public health authorities, the Federal Drugs Administration, for many years, despite the evidence, they absolutely ignored the problems that were becoming more and more apparent. And it wasn't until 2006, so 10 years after this drug was put on the market, it took 10 years for finally Purdue to lose a case in court. And they were fined $600 million. But this is 10 years later, and by this time, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people being addicted to this medication. So, what eventually brought Purdue under control was the fact that not just individual patients, but states, like West Virginia or whatever, Ohio, realized that this drugs plague on this scale was costing a lot of money. and at the end of the day, the state had to pay money to cope with this situation. So states started to take civil cases against Purdue, and bit by bit, the bills mounted. And in fact, the evidence pointed directly to the owners of the company, the Sackler family. They apparently, at one time, they were, maybe not now, they were one of the richest families in the United States. This one family privately owned the whole Purdue company. But anyway, 8 members of the family were alleged or were accused of being involved in a deadly and illegal scheme to deceive doctors and patients between 2007 and 2016 by encouraging sales reps to promote OxyContin at even higher dosages despite the dangers of the drug being well known. Yeah? So, unbelievably cynical. And during these same years, between 2007 and 2016, the Sackler family paid itself $4 billion in profit. $4 billion. That's $4,000 million for 8 people. In 2017, the US Center for Disease Control registered 191 million opiate prescriptions. 191 million. That is 58.7 prescriptions for every 100 citizens, including children. Get your head round that figure. 1 prescription for every 2 people of opiate. This really dangerous drug. What were the Sacklers doing in the meantime? They were protecting their reputation by giving money to all kinds of very, very famous and established institutions. You could call it culture washing, if you like. They made, with $4 billion in profit in 10 years, they had a bit of spare cash to throw around, didn't they? They made massive donations to, amongst others, the National Portrait Gallery in London, the Tate Museum in London, the Guggenheim. I don't know about the Guggenheim Bilbao, probably, but certainly the Guggenheim New York, the Metropolitan Museum in New York, Columbia University, the British Museum, Westminster Abbey, so the Church of England was taking money from them, Oxford University, the Jewish Museum in Berlin, the Louvre, the Royal Opera, Shakespeare's Globe Theatre in London, Yale University, the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, and Harvard University. All these institutions have been financed to a great extent since the year 2000 with dirty drugs money. Since the scandal has become public, most of these institutions have said either that they won't take any more money from the Sacklers, or, in a few cases, they've actually said that they're going to give the money back. There are some exceptions. Tel Aviv University, which is one of the biggest recipients of all, said, we don't care. We don't care what they do. We're going to carry on taking money from them. Any money's good for us. in September of this year, this is great, you know. What are the Sackler family going to do now that they've been found out? What do you think they're going to do? They filed for bankruptcy in September after reaching a deal for $10 billion, which it's apparently will resolve the majority of the hundreds of cases that have been brought out against them. However, so it's going to cost them $10 billion. However, during the court hearings, during the court proceedings, when lots of financial information was revealed, it emerged that the family had already taken between 12 and 13 billion out of the company to protect themselves against lawsuits. So they're not going to be travelling coach class anytime in the future. Even if they lose the company, they're not going to be short of a bob or two. So now Purdue says, no, this has cost us so much. We're going to go bankrupt. We won't be able to meet any more civil demands against us. The cases that are currently there, we'll close them, and everybody else, well, that's tough. That's not our responsibility. So it seems as though the Sackler family, at least, are out of the drugs business, and Purdue probably will not carry on as a major pharmaceutical company. But despite all that we've learnt, the FDA continues to license opiates, synthetic opiates of this kind, for prescription. So despite the experience with OxyContin, the regulatory authority hasn't changed its mind. Why do you think that might be? And the last reason that perhaps the last factor that we haven't talked about, but it's very important to understand in the United States as to why this drug and others like it, because OxyContin is the most notorious drug, but there are others. There's another drug called fentanyl. Has anyone heard of that, fentanyl? It's another synthetic opiate, and it's considered to be 10 times stronger than heroin. I mean, it's a really, really powerful opiate. And again, it's a prescription drug that is widely abused. It's thought that Prince, the singer Prince, it's thought that he died of a fentanyl overdose. But the reason why the United States population has been so vulnerable to this drug, one factor that we haven't talked about, is because of the level of poverty that exists in the United States. The United States is always thought of as being a very rich country. And it is a very rich country. It has, according to GDP statistics, it's the richest country in the world. But within that incredible wealth, there's also extreme poverty. And it's calculated that different figures fly around, but one figure is that 50 million US citizens live in poverty. That's according to official federal statistics. And that 1 in 4 children in the United States live in poverty. And when you talk about poverty, you have to think not that these are people that don't have jobs. A lot of the time these are people that do have jobs. but the jobs that they have are very, they pay very poorly indeed. And survival is an everyday struggle. Managing to put food on the table for your children every day, even with both people working, can be an incredible struggle. Has anybody seen film? I saw it, I'm thinking of it because I just saw it the other day. Has anyone seen the film Sorry We Missed You? If you haven't seen it, and if you're feeling strong, then go and see it, because it's really powerful, because it talks about a family in which both the mother and father are working, but however hard they work and however many hours a day they spend, they get more and more into debt. And I think that is a very common situation in the United States. It's certainly becoming more common in Britain. And when you're faced with a situation like that, then it's quite easy to understand how you could get hooked to drugs like this that are so easily available. And another thing that's made that made the situation more severe is because in the United States, side by side with this huge drugs problem, there is the sort of attitude, the culture which is behind the war on drugs, a very Puritan idea of, drugs are evil, drugs are very bad. And that means that, for example, programs which might exist here to help people who are addicts, like, for example, to make available drugs to help addicts escape from their addiction. Things like that are provided here, like needle exchange programs for people who are on heroin, to help them get off their, or at least to stay safe. Those kind of things don't exist in many parts of the United States because of this idea that drugs are evil, and therefore any kind of program which is seen as being soft on drugs is opposed by politicians. But I just think this, to finish off, this map here is quite interesting because it shows, where the drug deaths are in the United States, and it's very much in those parts of the country where the economy is doing badly. So you have, for example, West Virginia, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and that area there is known as the Rust Belt. The Rust Belt is the area where the old industries were, industries that have closed down, and where jobs are harder to come by. People, if they have jobs, they're badly paid jobs. So there's that definite connection between poverty and the amount of deaths. So, what's the solution to the situation? This epidemic is the number of deaths have come down a little bit, and the number of prescriptions have come down a little bit, but the epidemic is definitely an ongoing situation. So what do you think the solution could be? Do you think that drugs should be legalized? Is that a solution to the problem?
In some cases, yes. For the people who are dying or at a very strong pain, I could understand that.
Well, they are. I mean, obviously they're available
for a short period of time.
They are available for that. But the question I asked is, should all drugs be made legal? Because sometimes you hear arguments. There are a lot of arguments these days in favor of the legalization of drugs, because people say prohibiting drugs creates a black market, creates big profits, creates criminality, and therefore the best thing to do is to legalize drugs, and that way you can control them better, and there won't be criminality involved in it, and it will be better for public health and public safety. What's your opinion?
Of course not, because this sample you just put, this is another kind of criminality.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's the same.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
The alcohol is a legal drug, no? And the problem is with alcohol. No? And I think legalization drugs not solve the problem. No?
Any other points of view?
Is there a country where it's legalized?
Where drugs are legal?
Yeah.
I know marijuana is legal in Canada, and in fact it's increasingly legal in the United States. What about in the Netherlands? Are drugs legal in the Netherlands? Is there anywhere where heroin is legal, for example?
It is not the same soft drugs and hard drugs. Some of them are more addictive. We should control them better.
So you think things like cocaine, hard drugs like cocaine and heroin should stay illegal, whereas marijuana should be legalized? Anyone else?
This family now is buying the market of the marijuana.
Really? No.
They have started to sell the drug in good countries like India, for example.
Oh, really? The same, this OxyContin? No. That's just incredible, isn't it? Yeah. It's a good business, isn't it?
Good job.
But maybe it's a business of interest to governments, because I think that Donald Trump, in this case, is interested in having people drag for hand, I think. So it's not people, not the side. I think governments are behind these big companies.
So it's more than just money. There's a kind of political objective behind it.
Perhaps they want to get rid of some people, some kind of people.
Yeah, well, I mean, certainly you could see that there is, and there's been a lot of debate about this, that the war on drugs, so-called war on drugs, was definitely directed at a particular section of the population, the black population.
In this case, I think it's white population more than black. I have
Yeah.
a friend in the United States, and he told me that the target is white people of lower class, no black, white people.
Yeah.
No for black.
Yeah. No, it was crack was a drug that really hit the black community. That's right. Yeah.
In this case, is the target population is the white people.
Yeah, because perhaps they are more vulnerable to prescription drugs than they would be to illegal drugs. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, because with the war on drugs in the 1980s with crack, with the war on drugs was an excuse for massively increasing both the rate of incarceration, the rate at which courts sent people to prison, and also massively increasing prison sentences. So people were staying in prison longer. And the very huge proportion compared to their percentage within the population as a whole, the huge proportion of black people that were getting sent to prison led to an accusation that the whole war of drugs had an overriding political objective, which was to incarcerate black people. And also, in the United States, if you're in prison, or even if you've left prison but you have a criminal record, you lose the right to vote. Yeah.
Well, it's cheaper to prescribe drugs than to prescribe rehab or some medical treatment.
Yeah, well, yeah. But I mean, doctors prescribing, a doctor, how long did doctors spend training? 6 years? 7 years?
At least six and later, you can say 10 years, maybe. 6 in the university and later on.
Yeah.
I interesting your speech, but I think this is kind of distraction of the very problem, in my opinion. I am a doctor.
Right.
But I think the problem is the pharmacy industry is the second most important worldwide. And the question is how profitable is the drugs market in general. For example, right in our country, we have antithrombotic drug who is going to be introduced in the market. It costs 6 times more than the current drug, Citron, for example, without any drug controlling the side effects and without clear evidence about its effectiveness. And that's happening. It happens in different other drugs. For example, people don't care about the ancillum, the diazepam, and another drugs prescribed, for example, to control anxiety and another problems. And I think this kind of problem, I think it's a very important problem in the United States. The opioids epidemic, I think, could be used as a distraction of the very problem. The very problem is, in my opinion, the other.
What do you mean? A distraction? It's very interesting what you say.
It's a very important problem, and I think, as you mentioned before, in America, we can report some drugs epidemics, some opioid epidemics in the history. But I think the very problem, I think even for the pharmacist industry, is interested in trying to distract.
Right. So
on this problem
saying that it's only there in the United States, we don't have a problem here.
Because I disagree with the opinion that the government has a plan to control people by drugs. I disagree absolutely.
Yeah.
But my opinion is the other problem. But this problem is important. But if you see another problem, very different problems, even in our country, in Europe, for example, the problem of all those drugs who are manufacturing in India, for example, who have provoked side effects because of the water pollution on these industries. And this question has not been
raised.
Shared by has not been published by the India, for example, in the same way than the other. I think that, and that's why I say that it's a very important problem, but the very problem, the matter is the other problem.
The power of the pharmaceutical industry.
Yes, I think how the market, the drugs, the pharmacy market is controlled or managed in general.
So, what do you think? Is there a solution to that?
No, if they have the solution, I read in the European Union as president. I think it's very difficult because it's a matter of money, it's a matter of capitalism, it's a matter of the free market, it's a matter of different things. But I think there are a lot of interest at stake, and I think it's very different. That's my opinion. It starts when the pharmacists, for example, in Spain, it said that the pressure by the pharmacists to the government not to reduce the price of the drugs in general. Right now, the pharmacy industries are really profitable for the chemotherapy drugs, and they are more interested, more focused in this market than in the other one. But the question is, because the market is the market, and I don't know if I have a solution. Perhaps I haven't been here. In another place, or die, I don't know.
But I think that they should look why people is taking drugs, what type of country you are thinking. So I think that because of something people take drugs, so they should look what type of country they have, Europe too. So I think that they should look why people like this.
So you say we need to look at the deeper problems.
No, that you have to look why also people take drugs because they don't have money to take them on, because I don't know, because you are white or black or
Yeah.
I don't know. So, and this is one issue.
Yeah. Yeah. Any other comments? No?
Can you please write the name of the company?
Oh yeah, sorry. Of course.
Con el sonido.
And before we finish, just to mention the topic of next month's talk, we'll be talking about the idea of universal income. The idea that everyone should receive a basic income without having to work. It's an idea that's becoming more and more widely suggested. So we're going to look a bit about what possible forms of universal income people are suggesting, and then hopefully we'll have... I've really enjoyed the discussion today. Hopefully we'll have a similarly lively discussion about the pros and cons of universal income. Okay? So thanks for coming.